So a week ago, Friday, I had a totally different topic that I was going to speak about with this BBC. And I had no clue that this topic would change on October 7th. So on October 7th, as we all know now, the Hamas invaded Israel, and hundreds of people were killed, and at least 150 people have been taken hostage. Since that day, Israel says it has dropped 6,000 bombs on Gaza since Saturday, killing hundreds. Now, I have done some checking around. I'm going to share a lot of things that show craziness in this talk and show some common sense and humanity. And both are going on right now. So I have checked the numbers in a number of places and websites that I think are trustworthy, but who knows? So I'm going to go way back to when I was a child in Canada. And Remembrance Day in Canada is a very big deal. Every November 11th, schools run assemblies from kindergarten right up to grade 12. And if that day happens to fall on a weekend, the assembly happens on Friday. We don't miss it. And from the time I was a little kid, it was drilled into us days before the assembly that this was very serious. You don't burp in the assembly. You don't do anything to disrupt the crowd. You don't slap the person in front of you. Otherwise, you get removed. It is something to pay attention to. So in those days, they would bring in World War II veterans. They would be all decked out, in their uniforms, and they went easy on us because, it was an elementary school. They got more graphic with the grades as they got higher, but they would talk about, why they chose to go to World War II. And for a long time, guys, teenagers, lying about their age in Canada, signed up to go. They didn't finish high school because they thought it was the right thing to do to bring peace to the world. They had no clue what they were getting into. No clue. So I was very impressed by these assemblies. And then eventually, of course, I became a music teacher, and you get the job of organizing assemblies for Remembrance Day when you're the music teacher. And so my struggle always was how to make this relevant and keep it focused on peace. So the one phrase that I learned as a very tiny child is lest we forget. Lest we forget. So in my child mind, I simply thought that if we just all remembered what happened in World War II, this would never happen again. I was convinced of that. The adults told me that. The teachers told us this. And I thought, that's all you have to do. You just have to remember. I, of course, wasn't anywhere close to the Buddhist worldview as a child or as a young adult. And then because I got to know some Polish families, I would go to these Remembrance Day assemblies as an adult, and all of these Polish guys, really old guys in their uniforms, so proud to be there at the Cenotaph. Outside, November 11th in Alberta is usually darn cold. So we're outside, someone's playing the trumpet, they all cry, and they talk about what it meant for them to really try and bring secure peace so that their future, their kids and the future generations would have this. So again, I just thought right up until I met the Buddhist worldview, we just had to remember and be shocked by what we read. Well, we know now that that is not the case. Everyone is under affliction, under the power of afflictions and previously created karma. A very dear friend of mine that I knew for almost 4 decades, maybe longer. I knew him for a long time before he started talking about what he did in World War II. And it was in the late 1990s that one of the people that he was in a hut with in Holland, my friend was flying these missions to drop these bombs that would skip across and break up dams, and he was part of the dam busters team. So he became actually very famous. One of his friends who he met, so he was in a plane that clipped the trees. They had released the bomb. They clipped the trees, and all the guys, except for the pilot, bailed out of the plane. And my friend Fred ended up in Holland in, Royal, well, he was part of the Royal, not the Canadian. He was part of the London team. Anyway, he was in, military fatigues, and he and his friend were rounded up by a Dutch farmer, and they took him to this little hut in a forest in Holland where there were a number of other peoples, and it was part of the underground. And I'm not going to spend too long on this story, but he met a person, a Jewish fellow by the name of Ed Lessing, who eventually moved to New York City. So they obviously survived the whole thing. And it was a trip that Ed Lessing made to Rocky Mountain House in the late 1990s, where they got together all of Fred's family and friends and got Fred and Ed talking about this time in the hut in Holland. It was the first time that anyone knew what Fred had done during World War II and how he escaped. So, these things really get kept tight for people who go through it. Now, since 1946, or actually since the end of World War II, there have been no wars on the scale of World War II. So that's a good thing. However, since that time, there have been at least 250 wars or conflicts on the planet. So I'm sure that, if Fred was still alive and he's hearing about this conflict now, I'm sure he would be heartbroken because of what he and so many other people did, to ensure that we would have peace. So now I'm going to start sharing the things I've read, and I'll just pick out the things that were really impactful. Some of it is really crazy, and some of it, again, as I mentioned, is really on the humane side. So the Scottish First Minister, Humza Yousaf, said his parents-in-law are trapped in Gaza, and nobody can guarantee them safe passage anywhere. And he said he's giving an unequivocal condemnation of the Hamas attacks. So that is not, that is nothing to defend at all. And he warned that innocent civilians on both sides will suffer the most during these escalating attacks. And so he says, my thoughts go out to everyone because innocent civilians have nothing to do with this conflict. They have nothing to do with Hamas terror. They have nothing to do with the loss of life. And they're the ones, these innocent people on both sides of the border, who are paying the price. This is how crazy it is. And Venerable Children has mentioned this, so please see Venerable Children's BBC that she gave recently, and eventually a talk that she gave to the North Idaho College community will be online. Both, you can't make sure to see those and listen to them. And so this minister in Scotland is calling for a humanitarian corridor to allow vital supplies to the besieged enclave and to allow people to leave. Okay, so here's a flip side coming from someone else. Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant has announced a complete siege of the territory, saying that no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel will be allowed into this 25-mile strip of land that is home to 2.2 million people. Half of those people, more than 1 million people, are under the age of 18. So then there's this journalist who works for the New York Times. Her name is Amanda Taub, and she wrote about international law. Now this is partly crazy and partly there's sense here. The crazy part is that there's international law governing what's legal to do in a war. So killing is legal. Well, as Buddhists, we know that there is a very severe consequence for this. Anyone knows that there's a severe consequence for killing. However, is that in terms of what the Israelis are doing, the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, this is a violation of international humanitarian law. It's a crime against humanity, and it is a war crime. Civilians, this same international law says that civilians are entitled to protection. Armies and other armed groups cannot target them directly. Who's paying attention to this? Let's think of Ukraine. Let's think of every war on the planet. Nor can they disproportionately harm them in the course of pursuing legitimate military goals. So obviously the Hamas assault has involved multiple war crimes and crimes against humanity, some of which are ongoing. Now, Israel has called for this evacuation of more than 1 million people from the northern Gaza Strip. And the United Nations had a meeting scheduled for Friday that did happen, and that meeting was scheduled before this whole thing about the Israelis the Palestinians being forced to leave. And a UN spokesman by the name of Stefan Dujarric said that the evacuation cannot be conducted without devastating humanitarian consequences. And this will absolutely transform what is already a tragedy into a calamitous situation. It can't work. There's nowhere for them to go. This is the craziness. So in another article written on October 11th, Nicholas Kristof has some very meaningful things to say. And he says this: if we owe a moral responsibility to Israeli children, then we owe the same moral responsibility to Palestinian children. Their lives have the same equal weight. If you care about human life only in Israel or only in Gaza, then you don't actually care about human life. If your moral compass is attuned to the suffering of only one side, your compass is broken, and so is your humanity. So fortunately, we've met the Dharma. We know this. We get this. All of the Buddha's teachings are showing that this is true. We cannot take sides, and especially in a case like this, everyone loses. Everyone loses. I was happy to read yesterday that in addition to Biden pledging support for Israel, he also said this: it is the priority of his administration to address the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Palestine. We can't lose sight of the fact that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians have nothing to do with Hamas and their suffering. It's just so obvious. But I want to finish with an article that absolutely blows my mind because it is a combination of what Venerable describes as, we're such complex human beings and how we've got moments, of insight and moral compass and kindness and wisdom, and at other times we're just crazy. So this is an article by Peter Beinart. He's a journalist and commentator. And he writes this. This came out yesterday. I was in Austin, Texas for work on Saturday when I received a call from my commander in the Israeli Defense Forces to return to Israel and head to the front line. I didn't hesitate. I knew that the citizens of my country were in real danger. My duty, first and foremost, is to join the fight against those who have unleashed a massacre on my people. I boarded the first flight I found out of Austin to head home to join the IDF reserves, where I serve as a brigade operations command officer. Now, you won't believe what's going to come next. You've already got your mind made up about this guy. I did. But I'd like to say one thing clearly before I go to battle. There's no such thing as unavoidable. This war could have been avoided, and no one did enough to prevent it. Israel did not do enough to make peace. We just conquered the Palestinian territories in the West Bank, expanded the illegal settlements, and imposed a long-term siege on the Gaza Strip. Palestinians are not the enemy. The millions of Palestinians who live right here next to us between the Mediterranean Sea and Jordan are not our enemy. Just like the majority of Israelis want to live a calm, peaceful, and dignified life, so do Palestinians. Israelis must realize there's no greater security asset than peace. The strongest army cannot protect the country the way peace does. This current war proves it once again. Israel has followed the path of war for too long. At the end, after all the dead Israelis and Palestinians are buried, and after we've finished washing away the rivers of blood, the people who share a home in this land will have to understand that there's no other choice but to follow the path of peace. That is where true victory lies. Yet the work of moral rebuilding must begin. In Israel, Palestine, and around the world, pockets of Palestinians and Jews, aided by people of conscience of all backgrounds, must slowly construct networks of trust based on the simple principle that the lives of both Palestinians and Jews are precious, inextricably intertwined. May the world powers just insist that these two groups come together and talk, and that this conflict ends immediately, and may this be a model for future conflicts that may arise. And may we do everything possible to promote peace in the world.